Hello, and welcome back to our third presentation on Bible geometry. In this presentation, we're going to be exploring measures of space. We're going to get an idea of what they're talking about, the size space they're referring to, before we go on to see these numbers and their relations in the Bible. In this presentation, and moving on to the future, there's going to be numbers that may have quite a few zeros after them. So now's a good time to discuss that 0 is a latecomer in the world of numbers. In our modern day Hindu-Arabic numeral system, whenever we get into decimal places or tens, thousands, and million places, we use the number 0 in order to represent that. A good example of how that was not done before, and in fact other cultures use their alphabet to represent numbers, Roman numerals. If you're writing 105 in Roman numerals, it is CV. C stands for 100 and V stands for 5. But in our Hindu-Arabic numeral system, we would say 105. We know when we're in the space of 3 digits, we're in the hundreds, and we can read it. So I want you to view these zeros on these numbers, the significant numbers, as a placeholder. I don't care if it's 792, 7,920, 79,200, or 7,920,000. We're looking at that 792 and what that represents. Now you can expand the meaning of that to say that it is somewhat amplified by powers of 10, 1,000, and so on, which is a great deal of the significance of these numbers when we start looking at what they are in the Bible. And in this presentation and future ones, there may be slides that have a lot of numbers on them. I understand that that can be a little overwhelming at first glance, so I'm going to try and explain things line by line and point out what I find most significant about the numbers that we're looking at. But just know that you're not here to memorize all of this data, and you don't need to commit all of these numbers to perfect memory. I want you to use these videos or these presentations more as like a resource for reference when you come back to look at these things in your own investigations to see how they fit and lock together. Because the systems of measure we use in our modern day, not only did they come from and have a heritage from some of these ancient measures that we'll see, but that's sort of built into the measuring system in the Bible. It's almost like we're translating it from those older languages of measure into our modern languages of measure, almost as if our modern ones are direct descendants of those old ones. They have a lot in common, and you'll see how they fit together here shortly. Also, two measures that I'm going to be discussing in this presentation will be Ezekiel's cubit and Ezekiel's reed. If you want to read in Ezekiel chapter 43 to get how those measurements are derived, I've heard them called several things, and I think even the Bible calls it the great cubit in the book of Ezekiel. So you may hear me variously refer to Ezekiel's cubit, the great cubit, the long cubit. I have a few different names for it that I sort of use interchangeably, but you'll find out that Ezekiel's cubit is a cubit and a handbreadth, and that 6 of those make a reed. There's only 8 slides here, so this should be pretty short and simple. Let's crack on. We took a look at the Vitruvian Man in our first presentation, but here's an example of just a few measurements that are derived from the human body. Starting at the least of our practical measures, we have an inch, which we divide by 16ths. It's from the Latin word uncia, which means the 12th part. And I was taught variously that it is the width of a person's thumb or the finger's second joint. Of course, people have different sized fingers and thumbs, but your inch might be unique to you. And there are 12 inches in a foot. 36 inches in a yard. Well, we discussed already how that 12 and 36 are numbers of the sky as well, being seen in our constellations, but maybe that's a coincidence. There are 18 inches in the Hebrew cubit you commonly see in the Bible. There are 21.12 inches in Ezekiel's great cubit, 63.36 inches in a human pace. And here I want to point out, you see how those decimals act as a mirror of those two numbers? When we start talking about Ezekiel's city, we're going to see that in a lot of different contexts. You might see 2112, 4224, 6336, and 8448. And this convention describes something which I'm just very barely on the edges of understanding, so please be thinking about that, what that could mean when we get into what these numbers actually represent. As such, there are 63,360 inches in a mile and 7,920 inches in a furlong. 12 inches make a foot. And how about that? A foot is the length of a man's foot. There are 3 feet in a yard, 5.28 feet in a pace. Once again, that is a number I want you to remember. Even if you forget all these others, that's one you gotta have. 660 feet in a furlong, 5,280 feet in a mile. You may be able to tell that a mile is 1,000 paces. There's 1.5 feet in the Hebrew cubit, 1.76 feet in Ezekiel's cubit, and 10.56 feet in Ezekiel's reed. Now notice 10.56 is double 5.28. In a square foot, 144 inches, and in a cubic foot, 1,728. We should be getting pretty familiar with 144 by now, but 1,728 will come up later. And the foot does something very special for us. Exodus chapter 3, God says to Moses, "Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." And again to Joshua, the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, "Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy." And Joshua did so. The foot is what connects man to the earth. That's a very plain representation of that idea, but there is something a lot deeper going on there about the foot connecting man to the earth that we'll see when we begin to talk about New Jerusalem. The yard. As I was taught, this is when you turn your head sideways and stretch out your arm from the tip of your nose to the tip of your outstretched fingers. There are 1,760 yards in a mile, 220 yards in a furlong, 1.76 yards in a pace. It is double the Hebrew cubit, and there are 3.52 yards in Ezekiel's reed. 9 feet in a square yard and 27 feet in a cubic yard, 1,296 inches in a square yard. And if you're wondering how Ezekiel derived his great cubit, there's your answer. It's also the number of yards in a pace. Speaking of the pace, if the foot is what connects man to the earth, the pace is what moves man about the earth. No difficulty there, it's the length of a man's pace. There are 125 paces in a furlong, 1,000 paces in a mile, and as far as I know, that's how the Romans would found their city. They would put up a pole in the middle of what would then be the town square, which is something to think about. Towns built around a square, or cities built around a square. And they would walk off 1,000 paces, and that would be the border of the city. There are 2 paces in Ezekiel's reed, and 3 great cubits in 1 pace. See how these things fit together? The measures of the Bible and the measures of the human body are in agreement. The furlong. The furlong as a measure is in a state of disuse in our modern world, but looking down on that horse track there, you may have already recognized it. Our ancestors would have understood these spatial measures in the Bible perhaps more than we would today because they lived much closer to the land, or more down to earth, you could say. Practically everyone back then would have farmed in some capacity, and the furlong is a common farming measure. It is the length of a furrow in 1 acre, and as I understand it, the square footage of an acre is 660 by 66 feet. The furlong is 1/8 of a mile, which is 660 feet, or 440 cubits. There are 7,920 inches in a furlong. When we read in Revelation 14 about the 1,600 furlongs, that is 1,056,000 feet. So, like I said, you can ignore the zeros or see them as placeholders, and that is our 1056 popping up again. And that is 139.6th of the Earth's diameter, if that is how you pronounce decimal places. If you'll notice that number 396 again, it is half of 792. But we don't just see it in one place in the Bible. In Luke 24, we read about the disciples walking 60 furlongs from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is 39,600 feet. And once again, a occurrence of 396. These meaningful numbers in the Bible recur almost redundantly, but they recur in relational and sensical patterns that we'll be exploring as we go along. But already we have 2 occurrences of 396, which we know is half of 792. And finally, our largest measure, the mile, is from the Latin word mille, meaning 1,000. For example, a million is 1,000 thousands, and we measure very tiny things in millimeters, or spaces of time in milliseconds, that being 1,000th of a second. It is 1,000 paces. It is 5,280 feet, which is 8 furlongs, which is 500 of Ezekiel's reeds, or 3,000 great cubits. There's a very sparse map of my home to give you a good idea of the scale of a mile that we're working with. Thank you for joining me in this refresher of some commonly used measurements and measurements we see in the Bible. And be sure to keep up with us next time when we go over the measures of time. As we'll see, measures of space and measures of time share many common numbers and indeed common themes of them, which may sound a little perplexing at first, but there is a very good reason for it, and I know you'll be interested, so don't miss it.